Hello, everyone. You're welcome to the News Talk on the JMA Connections on this Sunday, the 28th day of December 2025. Today, in this News Talk, we'll be looking at some very interesting thing that is going on in Cameroon right now. So, this News Talk is titled Redistricting, Regime Survival, and the Politics of Fragmentation in Cameroon. It's absolutely a kind of redrawing of power. So why does redistricting matter at this point in time? And you want to know what redistricting is, because I could be using language that perhaps is now used mostly elsewhere. This is talking about the creation of new administrative units, new regions, new divisions, new subdivisions, and and the likes. That's what I'm talking about here. And why is it important at this time? Why does the government of Cameroon feel that this is a project they need to embark on right now? What is beneath it? That is the subject matter of this conversation. As Cameroon approaches the 2026 parliamentary and local elections, a proposed redistricting initiative has entered the national conversation with unusual intensity. The proposal seeks to expand the country's administrative structure from 10 regions to 20, a move officially presented as a strategy to bring governance closer to the people. Yet, beneath this administrative language lies a far more consequential political project, one that raises profound questions about the preservation of power, elite reproduction, electoral engineering, and the national cohesion in Cameroon. Redistricting is never a neutral exercise. Across political systems, especially in semi-authoritarian and authoritarian contexts, territorial reorganization often serves as a mechanism for redistributing power rather than redistributing services. Political philosopher Anna Arendt once observed that power preserves itself not by performing, but by expanding the number of those who depend on it. In essence, systems that fear accountability often choose multiplication over transformation. We need to note that during the last presidential election that took place on the 12th of October 2025, a lot of people, be them in the civil society, be them business people, and even military people, got involved in the massive rigging of the elections. We heard some parliamentarians, like Nkododan, talk about openly, brag about the fact that they did what they could do in his own constituency by all means to secure a win for ailing President Paul Biya, while at the same time announcing that in other areas in the West region, people spent as much as 50 million CFA francs to change votes. And so, therefore, you notice that the number of people who were involved this time to ensure that Paul Biya retains power has increased dramatically. In the business community, too many people poured in a lot of money. There are lists circulating of people who were contributing feverishly everywhere. Almost every single civil servant that held a post of responsibility contributed money and participated in one way or the other in the rigging. And therefore, compensation becomes a big deal. And therefore, the number or the elite base needs to be expanded so that at least everyone gets a pinch to compensate for what they sacrificed. And so, to do that, therefore, the government will not reform. Rather, they will expand the number of those who depend on it. That's why I say, in essence, systems that fear accountability often choose multiplication over transformation. So in Cameroon's case, the proposed increase in regions would automatically expand the political class, more parliamentary seats, more senators, more mayors, more regional assemblies, and of course, more administrative appointments. This expansion would occur in a system already characterized by patronage, centralized control, and elite loyalty to President Paul Biya, who has remained in power for over 4 decades. Now, let's look at elite expansion, because this thesis means multiplying power to preserve power. One dominant interpretation of the redistricting proposal is that it is fundamentally about elite expansion. By multiplying administrative units, the state creates new avenues for political reward. Each new region requires a governor, a regional council, security administrators, and allied political actors. Each new council produces mayors, deputies, and local elites whose political survival becomes tied to the continuity of the regime that created them. This strategy is not new. Regimes facing declining legitimacy often compensate by broadening the base of beneficiaries rather than reforming governance. Do not forget that Issa Chiruma Bakari and his team have continued to push the theory that right now Paul Biya and his cohorts lack legitimacy. They could boast of legality, but they lack legitimacy. And so, therefore, to try to get some form of legitimacy, this is why Paul Biya would act, like, as I just pointed out, that regimes facing declining legitimacy often compensate by broadening the base of beneficiaries rather than reforming governance. Previously, I've talked about group, an ethnic elite group of less than 3,000 people. The attempt now is perhaps to take that number to say about 5,000, 6,000 of those who directly depend on the survival of the regime and who will do everything to make sure it stays in place. Ghanaian revolutionary thinker Kwame Nkrumah warned of this pattern decades ago when he argued that neocolonialism survives by creating local elites whose prosperity depends on the system they should be dismantling. That is what France does. Simply do what? Create local elites whose prosperity depends on the system they should be dismantling. These ones will do everything possible to preserve the CFA franc. They will do everything possible to maintain the status quo. They will do everything possible to hold the people in underdevelopment as long as it benefits them as individuals. Kwame Nkrumah's point was that political systems can appear inclusive while remaining fundamentally extractive. In this sense, redistricting functions less as decentralization and more as controlled fragmentation, ensuring that loyalty is rewarded with office and access. The more people benefit from the existing system, the harder it becomes to mobilize unified opposition against it. From the capital, Yaoundé, the narrative emphasizes proximity to citizens. But critics argue that proximity without autonomy merely relocates control rather than dispersing it. Administrative closeness does not automatically translate into political empowerment, especially when fiscal authority, security oversight, and electoral arbitration remains tightly centralized. As political economist James C. Scott has noted, decentralization without power is simply centralization by another name. You want to get that absolutely correct. James C. Scott says decentralization without power is simply centralization by another name. Now let's look at the fragmentation of the resistance. So redistricting is just another electoral strategy. A second more strategic interpretation sees redistricting as a tool to dilute opposition strongholds. Regions historically resistant to the ruling establishment can be subdivided, with areas of softer or manufactured support elevated into full administrative regions. Over time, this weakens collective political identity and disrupts coordinated resistance. Electoral geography matters. When boundaries change, voting patterns change too. Representation shifts. What once functioned as a unified political bloc becomes a collection of smaller, more manageable units. This tactic has been employed globally by regimes seeking to survive electoral pressure without conceding power. Nigerian historian Claude Ake once cautioned that when states fear the ballot, they redesign the map. When states fear the ballot, they redesign the map. His insight captures how territorial manipulation often replaces political persuasion. In Cameroon, this logic is particularly salient in politically conscious regions where dissent has been persistent. Fragmentation does not eliminate opposition, it disorganizes it. It forces movements to fight multiple localized battles rather than a single national one. Let's look at the Southern Cameroon's questions. The Southern Cameroon's question within this redistricting exercise, because I see redistricting as a form of political assimilation. For Southern Cameroonians, the proposed redistricting carries an even deeper historical and existential weight. Many view the plan as a continuation of a long-standing project aimed at weakening the Southern Cameroon's liberation movement through administrative and geographic engineering. Yeah, you got that right? Many view the plan in the Southern Cameroons as a continuation of a long-standing project aimed at weakening the Southern Cameroon's liberation movement through administrative and demographic engineering. The fear is that new regions will be carved in ways that isolate Southern Cameroon's populations, merge them with predominantly La République du Cameroon citizen-speaking areas, that's French-speaking areas, and gradually normalize assimilation into the structures of the Republic of Cameroon. Such a process will not require overt force. Over time, altered boundaries would reshape education systems, administrative language, electoral demographics, and political representation. In doing so, redistricting could erode the territorial coherence upon which claims to self-determination and even a return to a meaningful two-state federation are grounded. Amilcar Cabral, the renowned anti-colonial strategist, warned that domination does not end with soldiers. It survives through institutions that reshape the minds and spaces of the dominated. This concern is often linked to the broader geopolitical interests of France, whose historical influence in Cameroon continues to shape political calculations in Yaoundé. For critics, redistricting is not simply domestic reform, but part of a larger effort to stabilize a familiar political order at the expense of unresolved historical grievances. You definitely recall that while in France and in a publicly televised interaction with Mo Ibrahim, ailing Paul Biya, president of Cameroon, did not mince his words. He said clearly that the ambition had always been to assimilate the people of the southern Cameroons into the broader La République du Cameroon. He regretted that they thought it was going to be such an easy project, but things did not work out as planned. Clearly put, for Cameroon and for France, the federal system introduced in 1961, the agreement entered into, was only an interim approach that would later on be shelved aside and turned into outright annexation. And this is exactly what it is. The only thing they thought about was that there could be some resistance, but at the same time, they had prepared the kind of machinery that we are seeing right now that would be used to quell resistance, outright brutality, military invasion, enforced disappearances, looting, enforcement of the policy of poverty, and outright dehumanization to discourage all those who will be wanting to stand up to free the southern Cameroons to fear vexing reprisals. Another approach has been to create an elite base that would be used to resist any attempt by the masses to break loose of La République's colonial domination and France's direct hand in the entire project. That is why until today, you notice that those who are fighting tooth and nail, who are putting in all their effort, who are ready to kill themselves to make sure the status quo is maintained, are those few elite who are benefiting from the current system and from the status quo. That is why this redistricting would only provide an opportunity to create a new set of such elite that will make the resistance to the project of the masses even stronger. But only that, the people are hyper vigilant. The people have taken note. The people are talking about it. And the people are working towards making sure no such effort ever succeeds. Of course, there are examples that abound where such efforts are using redistricting to thwart a liberation movement ended up failing woefully. That's why I'm now making a comparative lesson. When redrawing borders fails, history offers important lessons for states that attempt to repress self-determination through administrative manipulation. Let's move to East Timor, or what we call Timor-Leste. In East Timor, Indonesian authorities repeatedly reorganized territories, promoted demographic shifts, and created new administrative units in an effort to integrate the region permanently into Indonesia. Did you get that? So what is happening now? What the Republic of Cameroon is seeking to do through Atanga Ponji is not novel. It's not something that has never been done anywhere else. It has been done with a lot of, verve, but it failed. That's why I'm just bringing up the case of Timor-Leste, that's East Timor, to make it clearer to you. I get it back right here, that in East Timor, Indonesian authorities repeatedly reorganized territories, promoted demographic shifts, and created new administrative units in an effort to integrate the region permanently into Indonesia. These measures failed because they addressed symptoms rather than the core issue. The Timorese demand for sovereignty stayed. They addressed the symptom. They did not address the core issue. And what was the core issue? The core issue was the Timorese demand for sovereignty. During the struggle, resistance leader Zanana Gusmao famously stated, "They can occupy our land, but they cannot occupy our will." They can occupy our land, but they cannot occupy our will. The quote reflected the reality that administrative control did not extinguish political consciousness. Despite decades of territorial engineering, East Timor ultimately achieved independence. And of course, East Timor today is independent. Similarly, South Sudan experienced repeated internal boundary changes under Khartoum's rule. These were designed to divide ethnic groups, weaken liberation movements, and complicate claims to nationhood. Instead, they reinforced the perception that unity within Sudan was impossible under imposed structures. SPLM leader John Garang warned that a system that survives by dividing its people is already living on borrowed time. Sounds familiar. The effort by La République du Cameroon to divide the people of the southern Cameroons are not new. They didn't even start today. First, the southern Cameroons entered into the unfaithful or into that evil union with La République du Cameroon as southern Cameroons, not as southwest and northwest. When the territory entered into that union, we simply had divisions. You had the Bamenda division, the Kumba division, Fako division, and the likes. We do not have southwest and northwest. That particular approach was used by Yaoundé and Paris with the clear design of identifying the anthropological and sociological composition of the land, making sure people were ripped apart and guaranteeing that there will never be any clear access route between the two territories, that between the two provinces at the time, northwest and southwest. You will recall that Kumbamamfe never had a road. You will recall that to travel from Bamenda to Kumba, you still need to go through La République du Cameroon. Two regions of La République du Cameroon. And vice versa. The objective was clear. Divide the people the more, and then bring in a kind of narrative. Create stories that indicated that this one did this to the other one when they were only themselves. And now you have that notion, therefore, of a northwest-southwest divide. You have that notion, therefore, of Graffiti and forest people. You have that notion, therefore, of Come No Go. So you see, all of those things were not simply a mistake of nature. No, they were clearly designed. They were neatly planned, and they were assured that by using historians who will come in and claim that there were so many problems between the forest people of the southern Cameroons and those of the grass field, making that they were so great that these people can never ever live again together. If you read 100 Years of History by Professor Victor Julius Ngo, it tells you exactly this. And they've made so many efforts with Paul Biya using political appointments also to create a much wider gulf. At one point, more ministers will come from the northwest, perhaps no one from the southwest. At another point, almost everyone from the southwest and no one from the northwest. Then the position of prime minister is used, in alternation to try and continue to deepen that divide, create suspicions, and make the people constantly fighting against each other in such a way that to focus on the fight, on the fight geared at weeding out La République du Cameroon becomes a bit complicated. Only they never considered that Gen Z would come with a completely different philosophy. And so they were taken aback in 2016 in this phase of the Southern Cameroon's liberation movement when the entire territory acted as one man. They now observed that there's been a bridge between the elite and the base, and the bridge between the elite and the base had collapsed. And when the bridge between the elite and the base collapsed, they noticed that the elite no longer had a hold on the masses, and the masses are overwhelmingly in favor of absolute independence. That much again they saw on the 22nd of September 2017, when over 3 million people filled the streets of the southern Cameroons in all the nooks and crannies of the territory to talk about liberation, to talk independence. And that is the single thing that has been frightening to them beyond proportions. And that is why this redistricting to them is another clear approach at seeing how to, succeed perhaps where the current political, divide and rule has failed. Therefore, it failed in Eritrea. No, it failed in Timor-Leste. It failed in South Sudan. As you heard SPLM leader John Garang say that a system that survives on dividing its people is already living on borrowed time. South Sudan's independence was not prevented by fragmentation. On the contrary, it was accelerated by it. In the Horn of Africa, Eritrea faced similar tactics from Ethiopia, including administrative restructuring and political absorption strategies. These measures failed to extinguish Eritrean national consciousness. Eritrean leaders often emphasized that borders drawn for control could never generate loyalty. Prolonged resistance ultimately culminated in internationally recognized independence for Eritrea. So the common thread across these cases is clear. Administrative fragmentation cannot substitute for political legitimacy. When a people's demand is rooted in history, identity, and collective memory, redrawing lines on a map does not dissolve it. I'll conclude here by saying redistricting is also a political risk. Cameroon's proposed redistricting is presented as reform, but its political implications suggest something far more precarious. By expanding elites, fragmenting resistance, and reshaping contested territories, the state may succeed in delaying confrontation, but not in resolving it. History shows that when governance strategies prioritize regime survival over inclusion and justice, they often produce the very instability they seek to avoid. For Southern Cameroonians, the stakes are especially high. Territorial dilution threatens not only current political claims but the very framework through which future negotiations might occur. For Cameroon as a whole, the lesson from East Timor, South Sudan, and Eritrea is sobering. Power preserved through division is rarely power secured for the long term. As for the 2026 local and parliamentary elections approach, the question is no longer whether redistricting will change Cameroon's political landscape. It already has. The real question is whether those changes will lead towards durable peace or deeper fragmentation. I'd like to thank you all for your very careful attention. If today is the first day that you're listening or watching me on the News Talk on the JMA Connection, then make it a constant rendezvous. On Sundays when it is 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time or 10 p.m. Southern Cameroon's time, 10 p.m. Central and West African time. If you're not yet subscribed to the JMA Connections, go right ahead and do that. And make sure you personalize so that each time something new drops on this platform, you will be the first to know. But most especially, make sure you share the link to this communication as much as possible so we continue to expand our reach. Also encourage as many people as possible to subscribe. We have a target of attaining at least 50,000 subscribers by the end of the month of March. Let's do it, folks. We can. Thank you very much for your very kind attention, and to God be all the glory.